Everyone at Voss Capital had a story about the first time they saw Stellan Voss walk into a room and watched it go quiet. Mine happened on my third day of employment. I was carrying 2 cups of coffee and a stack of quarterly reports down the corridor on the 38th floor, minding my own business, when the elevator doors at the far end opened and out stepped the most immaculate human being I had ever seen in my life. He was tall in the way that made ceilings feel lower, dressed in a charcoal suit that had clearly never experienced the indignity of an off-the-rack rack. His dark hair was swept back with a severity that matched the line of his jaw, and he moved like someone who had never once questioned whether they had the right to occupy a space. The hallway, which had been buzzing with activity, was so still I could hear my own heartbeat. I did not know who he was yet. I was 3 days in, still figuring out which elevator bank served which floors and whether the barista on the lobby level would remember my order. But I felt the shift in the air, as if someone had turned down the temperature by 10 degrees and sucked all the oxygen out along with it. "You're in my way." His voice was low and even, and it was directed at me. I looked down at my hands. I was, in fact, standing directly in the center of the hallway, frozen, both coffee cups steaming, the reports fanned out against my chest like a paper shield. "Sorry." I stepped to the side. He passed without another glance, and the entire corridor seemed to exhale at once. "That," whispered my new colleague Petra from the doorway of the copy room, wide-eyed and pressing herself flat against the frame, was Stellan Voss. "The CEO?" "Executive Director of Acquisitions. The CEO is his uncle. Stellan runs the acquisitions division, and also, terrifyingly, anything else he decides he wants to run that week." She grabbed my elbow and pulled me into the copy room. "Rule 1, do not make eye contact unless he makes it first. Rule 2, if he asks you a question, answer it in the fewest possible words. Rule 3, do not under any circumstances be standing in the middle of a hallway holding things." "Good rules," I said. Extremely helpful on day 3. Her name was Petra Holst, and she became my closest friend in that building, which was not a difficult achievement, given that most of the staff communicated primarily through furtive glances and Slack messages sent from the bathroom. She had been at Voss Capital for 3 years, long enough to have developed a taxonomy of Stellan Voss moods and what each meant for the floor's collective survival. There was the quiet that meant he was thinking, which was fine, the quiet that meant he was displeased, which was not fine, and the quiet that meant he had already decided something and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up, which was almost worse than the displeasure, because at least displeasure gave you something to respond to. I worked in the contracts and documentation division, which meant I had occasional business with the acquisitions department, and therefore occasional proximity to Stellan Voss. Most days this was manageable. I handed off files, received corrections in red ink, so precise they looked printed, and retreated. I did my job well. I was thorough and fast, and I had the particular omega quality of being able to anticipate what an alpha wanted before they finished the sentence, which in most professional contexts was an asset, and in the context of Stellan Voss felt more like a survival skill than a talent. He was an alpha in the way that made the word feel inadequate. Everything about him was controlled and deliberate, like a building designed to withstand weather that hadn't happened yet. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. He simply looked at you, and somehow that was worse. I spent 11 months carefully managing my distance from him and doing a very good job of it. Then my sister died, and everything I had been carefully managing fell apart. Her name was Marin, and she was 4 years younger than me and twice as brave, and she had a 6-week-old daughter named Sable, and no one in the world left to leave her with except me. The call came on a Friday evening, a car accident on the coast road, sudden and without ceremony, the way all terrible things refuse to announce themselves politely. I drove 3 hours to the hospital, sat in a white corridor for 2 more, and was handed a baby by a nurse with exhausted, kind eyes who told me that Marin had listed me as guardian in her will and that the paperwork had already been initiated. I held Sable in the parking lot of the hospital for a very long time. She was asleep, indifferent to the seismic restructuring of my life, one tiny fist pressed against her cheek. She smelled like something that had no name in any adult vocabulary I possessed. "All right," I said to her. "I have no idea what I am doing." She did not respond. She was 6 weeks old. I drove home with a car seat borrowed from the hospital social worker and a bag of formula and supplies that the same social worker had assembled with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this before. I set the car seat on my kitchen table, looked at Sable, and then sat on my kitchen floor and cried until I had nothing left in me. Then I got up, washed my face, and started learning. The internet, it turns out, contains an extraordinary volume of conflicting information about infant care. I watched 17 different videos on how to swaddle a baby and came away more confused than before. I called my mother, who had not spoken to Marin or me in 8 years following a disagreement I will not detail here, and was told that she was very sorry for my loss, but that she could not take on this kind of responsibility at her stage of life. I hung up before I said something I would not regret. I had 1 week of bereavement leave from Voss Capital. Then I had technically 3 months of family leave I could request, but the thought of being away from work for 3 months while Stellan Voss and his division continued to process acquisition contracts filled me with a specific professional dread that grief had not yet fully muffled. I went back to work after 10 days. I brought Sable because I had no other option. Let me be clear that this was not a plan I had developed with any significant foresight. My usual childcare arrangement, which I had scrambled to put together in the preceding days, fell through that morning at 7:45 when the nanny agency called to say their placement had a family emergency of her own. I had a 9 o'clock meeting with the legal team on the 14th floor. I had a contract review deadline at noon. I had a baby who was, at that moment, asleep in her carrier, strapped to my chest, hidden under an oversized cardigan I was wearing like a prayer. The plan, such as it was, get through the morning, arrange backup care by lunch. No one would know. I made it past security. I made it into the elevator. I made it to my desk on the 32nd floor, sat down, and spent 45 minutes working in the most careful, controlled stillness of my life, while Sable slept against me, warm and oblivious, her tiny breathing synced to mine. Petra arrived at 8:45, put her bag on her desk, looked at me, looked at the slight but unmistakable small human-shaped lump under my cardigan, and sat down without saying a single word. She opened her laptop. Then she reached into her desk drawer and slid a granola bar across to me, and I could have wept from gratitude. The 9 o'clock meeting was conducted via video call, which I joined with my camera deliberately angled so only my face and shoulders were visible, and which I successfully navigated through 17 minutes of contract discussion without incident. The incident happened at 11:15. I was at the printer, retrieving documents, Sable still in the carrier, when the elevator opened and Stellan Voss stepped out on my floor. He did not come to the 32nd floor often. He did not need to. People were generally brought to him, rather than the reverse. But here he was, striding toward the documentation supervisor's office with a folder under his arm, and I was standing between him and that office with a baby strapped to my chest. His gaze went from my face to the carrier to my face again. He stopped. The silence stretched. "Kieran," he said, because he knew my name. Somehow that had always unnerved me, that he knew the names of everyone who worked in his building. "Good morning." The documents were shaking slightly in my hands. I willed them to stop. He looked at the carrier again. Something moved behind his eyes. Not displeasure exactly. Something more complicated than that, though I could not read it. "My regular care arrangement fell through," I said, and then stopped because he had not asked. He continued to look at me, in that way he had, the way that made you feel your clothes were see-through. Then he said, "Come to my office at 2. He walked past me. I stood there for a moment, documents in hand, baby on chest, and felt the particular brand of doom that comes from not knowing whether you are about to be fired or given a raise. It was, I was fairly certain, going to be the former. His office occupied the corner of the 38th floor with views of 2 sides of the city, which at 2 in the afternoon were washed in pale winter light that made everything look either very beautiful or very cold, depending on your state of mind. Walking in, I was prepared for cold. Sable was awake now, which complicated matters. She was making small, exploratory sounds, the ones that preceded hunger sounds, and I had her bottle in the bag over my shoulder and was calculating how long I had before the exploratory sounds became non-negotiable. Stellan was behind his desk. He watched me come in and did not look at my face immediately. He looked at Sable. "Sit down," he said. I sat in one of the low chairs across from his desk. Sable turned her head at the change in angle and made a thoughtful noise. "How old?" 7 weeks. I readjusted her position in the carrier. "I know this is completely inappropriate, and I apologize, The agency placement had an emergency this morning, and I have interviews scheduled with 2 other agencies this week, and it will not happen again. Your sister." His voice was level. "I was informed about the bereavement. I'm sorry." It was such a plain sentence, delivered so simply that it caught me somewhere unexpectedly soft. "Thank you. Who else does the child have?" "Just me." The words still felt strange in my mouth, like biting down on something harder than expected. "Our parents are not involved." Marin listed me as guardian. It was a surprise, a good surprise. I paused. A terrifying good surprise. He was quiet for a moment. Sable made a sound that was beginning its escalation toward hungry. "I need to feed her," I said. "I am sorry. Can you tell me quickly whether I'm being let go so I can plan my afternoon?" Something changed in his expression. It was subtle, barely a shift, but I had spent 11 months learning to read that face from safe distances, and it was not what I expected. It looked almost like the corner of his mouth wanted to do something. "You're not being let go." He stood. "Feed the child. I'll get coffee." He walked to the sideboard against the wall, where a sleek coffee machine sat alongside an assortment of cups, and he poured 2, without asking if I wanted one, and I sat in his office on the 38th floor and fed my 7-week-old niece a bottle, while the most feared man in the building made me an Americano. It was, objectively, one of the stranger moments of my adult life. He set the coffee beside me and returned to his desk and began working as though this was entirely unremarkable. I fed Sable. She ate with the single-minded intensity that was her most consistent personality trait so far. The city light moved through the windows. It was almost peaceful, in the way that very surreal things sometimes feel peaceful. "You're managing the Aldrin contract review," he said, not looking up from whatever he was reading. "Yes, I'm ahead of schedule. It won't be affected. I'm not worried about the Aldrin contract." He turned a page. "I'm asking because the scope expanded yesterday. I'm adding 3 additional subsidiaries to the acquisition structure. The documentation team will need to be notified, and the timeline will need adjustment. I can do that today. The revised brief will be in your system by 4. Understood." Sable finished the bottle, and I shifted her to my shoulder and began the careful back patting that the internet had unanimously agreed upon as burping methodology. Stellan Voss continued to work. Occasionally he glanced over, briefly, and then looked back at his documents. "Have you slept?" he said at some point. The question surprised me. "Some. That's not an answer. Approximately 4 hours in the last 2 days. But she's starting to consolidate her nighttime sleep. The books say that happens around 8 weeks. The books. I've read 11. I paused. They contradict each other on everything except the 4-month sleep regression, which they all agree is going to be horrible." He was quiet for a moment. "You moved back to the office after 10 days. I needed the work." It was honest. The work had been the only thing that felt familiar, the only structure I recognized. Sitting at my kitchen table, with Sable asleep in the bassinet, and grief pressing down on my chest like a physical weight, the contracts had been something to hold on to, something I was competent at. Also, the documentation backlog does not care about personal circumstances. "You could have asked for additional leave." I could have. I looked down at Sable, who had achieved a full and contented burp with considerable dignity, and was now looking around the office with the wide, philosophical gaze of someone experiencing Windows for the first time. Coming back helped. He did not respond to that, but something in his posture shifted slightly, a minute adjustment of the shoulders, and I had the odd feeling that he understood what I meant better than most people would have. I stayed in his office for 40 minutes. It was the most peaceful I had felt in 10 days. I did not examine why too closely. The childcare situation resolved itself within the week. I found a wonderful woman named Dorothy, who had raised 4 children of her own and operated a home childcare with the calm authority of a general who has seen everything and is no longer surprised by any of it. She took one look at Sable and one look at me and told me to go sleep for 8 hours, and she would handle the rest. I cried on her doorstep, and she told me that was normal, and handed me a biscuit. With Dorothy in place, life acquired something like a rhythm. I worked, I came home, I fed Sable and bathed Sable and sang to Sable with rapidly improving technique, having discovered early on that she had very specific opinions about musical tempo. I fell asleep with contracts on my chest. I woke up and did it again. What I did not expect was Stellan Voss. He began sending the revised Aldrin briefs directly to me, rather than through the chain of documentation supervisors, which was unusual. He began, when passing my floor or encountering me in the corridor, to pause briefly and ask how things were going. Not in the performative way that managers sometimes did, the way that did not actually want an answer. In the way that waited for one. "How's the 4-month sleep progression?" he said one morning in the elevator, 6 weeks after the office incident. I nearly dropped my coffee. "You remembered that." "I remember things." "She's 10 weeks. We haven't hit it yet." I tucked my bag under my arm. The books say to enjoy the current stretch while it lasts, which is an ominous way to phrase a developmental milestone. "You're still reading the books. I bought 2 more. There's one specifically about the neurological development of infants in their first year that is either fascinating or terrifying, depending on the page." The elevator reached his floor, and he stepped out, and just before the doors closed, without turning around, he said, "Let me know how it goes." I stood in the elevator for 2 more floors before I remembered I needed to push a button. Petra, when I reported this exchange, stared at me for a very long time. "Stellan Voss asked you about your baby's sleep progression." "My nieces, and yes." "Kieran, I know. That is not a thing Stellan Voss does, I know." She stared some more. "What are you going to do about it?" "Nothing," I said, because this was the obvious answer. He was the executive director of acquisitions at the company where I was a mid-level contracts officer. He was an alpha who made entire boardrooms hold their breath. I was an omega, running on minimal sleep with formula stains on my good shirts, and a baby bouncer in my living room that played the same 6 notes on a continuous loop until I had started hearing them in my dreams. Whatever brief window of something had opened between us in his corner office, it was not the beginning of a story. It was a strange and gentle anomaly. I was grateful for it. I would not be foolish about it. This resolution lasted approximately 3 weeks. Then he appeared at my apartment at 11:45 on a Wednesday night. I should explain the context. Earlier that day, a critical error had been discovered in the initial documentation framework for the Aldrin acquisition, one that had the potential to create significant legal complications if not caught before filing. The error was not mine, but it fell within my area of the work, and I had volunteered to stay late and coordinate the corrections with the legal team. This had extended into the evening, and by 9 o'clock I had called Dorothy and asked if Sable could stay overnight, which Dorothy had agreed to with absolute unruffled grace. At 10, I had been one of the last people in the building. At 10:15, Stellan had walked past the documentation floor, seen my light on, and come in. We had worked through the remaining corrections together, his knowledge of the acquisition structure allowing us to move faster than I could have alone. By 11, it was resolved. "Go home," he had said, gathering his jacket from the back of a chair he had commandeered. "I need to do one more." "It's done, go home." A pause. "You look exhausted." "I am exhausted." I went home. I arrived to find a note under my door from my downstairs neighbor, informing me that my apartment's hot water had been shut off due to an emergency repair that would take until morning. My phone, in my coat pocket, had also died at some point during the commute, which I discovered when I tried to call Dortha to check on Sable. I was standing in my dark kitchen, cold, phoneless, and staring at the note when there was a knock at my door. It was Stellan. He was still in his work shirt, jacket over his arm, and he looked at me and then at my apartment, and then, perceptively, at the note in my hand. "Hot water's out," I said, because there was no more useful way to begin this sentence. "I know. Your neighbor posted about it in the building's community board. I saw it. I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed." He paused. "And your phone is off." "Dead battery." We looked at each other. "The child is at the carer's tonight," he said. It was not a question. She stayed over. The work ran late. He held up his phone. "Do you need to call?" I did. I borrowed his phone, called Dortha, confirmed Sable was fine and asleep, and that Dortha herself was untroubled by the extension, and handed the phone back. "Thank you," I said. "There's hot water in my building," he said, "if you need to shower." I opened my mouth and closed it again. "My building is 4 blocks from here. I have a guest room." His voice was completely level, the way it always was, but there was something underneath it, something careful. "It's a practical offer. You've been working since 7 this morning, and you had an 11-hour day, and you're cold. There's no agenda." I believed him. That was the thing. In the year I had observed Stellan Voss, I had never once seen him be anything other than exactly what he presented himself to be. He did not make social gestures he did not mean. He did not say things lightly. If he said there was no agenda, there was no agenda. And I was, genuinely, very cold and very tired. "Let me get my bag," I said. His apartment was on the 42nd floor of a building that had a lobby like a museum foyer, and it was exactly what I had expected. Immaculate, spare, high-ceilinged, with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the lit city below. Everything was in shades of deep navy and charcoal and warm wood. There was an entire wall of books, a kitchen that looked used but organized with the same precision as everything else. It did not look like a cold place. That was what surprised me. I had expected something sterile, the visual equivalent of his professional persona. But they were objects that spoke of attention and care. A clay bowl on the kitchen counter that was clearly handmade and imperfect. 3 or 4 framed drawings, abstract and slightly rough-edged, the kind of thing someone makes themselves rather than buys. A deep sofa with blankets folded over its back in a way that suggested they actually got used. "Guest room is through there," he said, pointing down the hallway. "The bathroom is the second door. There are clean towels in the cabinet." "Thank you." I stood in the middle of his living room and looked at the city for a moment. It was very beautiful at this hour, all that light scattered across the darkness like something deliberate. "Your apartment doesn't look the way I expected." "How did you expect it to look?" "I don't know. More like your office." "My office is a workplace. This is where I live." He moved to the kitchen, and I heard the particular sound of a kettle being filled. "Tea or something stronger?" "Tea, please. I need to sleep tonight." I showered in his bathroom, which was large and warm and had a glass shelf lined with things that were expensive but not ostentatious, and I stood under the hot water and thought about how strange and specific life was, that grief and chance and a broken water heater had led me here, to the 38th floor Alpha shower at midnight. When I came out, there was tea on the kitchen island, and Stellan was sitting on the sofa with a book, and he had changed out of his work shirt into a dark sweater, and I had genuinely not prepared myself for what Stellan Voss looked like in a dark sweater being quiet in his own home. He looked like a person. It sounds obvious. He was, of course, a person. But in the building, in the corridors and meeting rooms and elevator encounters, he had always been something more like a force than a person, a weather system with a suit. Here, with his shoes off and a book in his hands and a mug on the table, he was just a man. I sat at the kitchen island and wrapped my hands around the tea and said, without planning to say it, "Do you get lonely?" He looked up from the book. "I'm sorry," I said immediately. "That's an intrusive question. It's an honest one." He was quiet for a moment, looking at me in that calm, assessing way he had. "Sometimes. Less than I used to." "What changed?" He seemed to consider this. "Giving myself things to pay attention to. Work, books, the building's community board apparently." A pause. "Your infant's sleep progression." I laughed. I surprised myself by laughing, a real one, the kind that had been somewhat absent lately. He watched me laugh with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. And I felt something shift between us, a small but significant tectonic movement in the architecture of whatever we were to each other. "I should sleep," I said eventually. "You should." "Thank you for this. Genuinely. Sleep well, Kieran." I went down the hallway to the guest room, which had a bed made with the kind of taut military precision that somehow managed to also be comfortable, and I lay in the dark and thought about the clay bowl in the kitchen and his reading voice, which I hadn't even heard but could imagine perfectly, and the very careful way he had said, "Less than I used to." I did not sleep immediately. I do not know what I thought would happen after that night. I went home in the morning to restored hot water and sent him a thank you message that he replied to with a single "good," which was, in retrospect, the most Stellan thing he could have possibly sent. What happened was, Sable turned 4 months old, and the books were right. The 4-month sleep regression arrived with the force of a personal reckoning. She had been, up until this point, a relatively manageable sleeper, waking twice a night with predictable timing. The regression scrambled everything. She began waking every 45 minutes to 2 hours in an unpredictable rotation, and each waking required a full reset involving feeding or rocking or both, and I began to understand why certain historical accounts of sleep deprivation categorize it alongside other extreme human experiences. I want to be clear that I was managing. Dorothy helped during the day, and I functioned at work, and I kept up with my contracts. But by the third week of the regression, I was operating at something like 30%, and the bags under my eyes had achieved geological depth. Stellan noticed on a Monday. He did not say anything in the moment, only looked at me in the corridor with that particular expression that meant he was filing information away. On Wednesday, he stopped by my floor in the early afternoon, which he had never done before, and deposited a coffee on my desk, black with 1 sugar, which was exactly how I took it, and kept walking. On Friday, when I was leaving the building, he was in the lobby. "Come to dinner," he said. Not a question, not quite a command either, which for him was a significant distinction. "Sable has an appointment at 5:30, I said. "I know. It's 6:30. He said it so matter-of-factly that it took me a moment to realize he had timed the invitation around an appointment he should not have known about unless he had been paying closer attention to me than I had registered. "You need a meal that isn't eaten standing over your kitchen sink." "How do you know I eat standing over my sink?" "Because you bring meal prep containers to work that are always half-finished." His gaze was steady. "You're not eating properly." This is a genuinely alarming level of observation. I pay attention to things I care about. It landed so simply, so without performance, that I had no immediate defense for it. 6:30. "There's a place 2 streets from here. It's quiet. You can tell me about the sleep regression." I went to dinner. We sat across from each other in a small restaurant that was warm and not loud, and he asked me about Sable with the specific, focused curiosity he brought to things he actually wanted to understand. And I found myself telling him everything. The 4 a.m. feedings, and the particular cry that meant overstimulated rather than hungry, and the way she had, just that week, begun to follow my face with her eyes in a way that made my whole chest collapse with something enormous and unnamed. "You love her," he said. "Completely," I said. I did not expect to love anything this much this fast. "I don't think there's a way to prepare for it." "No," he agreed quietly. "Do you want children?" I asked, and then winced slightly, because we were at dinner twice, and I had asked this man 2 deeply personal questions in the span of the same number of encounters, and I was beginning to develop a pattern. But he did not deflect. I thought I didn't. I wasn't sure I had the temperament. He looked at his wine for a moment. "I'm revising that." We were quiet for a beat, and the air between us was doing something I refused to put a name to. And then Sable, who was in her carrier on the seat beside me, having fallen asleep on the walk over with the arbitrary mercy that babies sometimes bestow, made one of her small exploratory sounds. Stellan looked at her. "Can I hold her?" he said. He said it carefully, like he was aware it was a slightly significant request. I looked at him. This man who commanded boardrooms, who had 37 people reporting to him, who had never in my observation been anything less than completely in control of his environment, asking to hold a 4-month-old with the same exact precision he brought to everything else. "Yes," I said. I transferred her to him. She blinked at the change, looked up at his face and apparently found it acceptable, because she settled with the easy adaptability of someone who had not yet developed the self-consciousness of older humans. He held her with an instinctive care that surprised me, adjusting to her weight, completely still. He looked down at her for a long time. When he looked up at me, something had changed in his face. The first time he was at my apartment past midnight was 6 weeks after the restaurant. It had become a different kind of story by then, one that was still careful and still slow, but that was unmistakably a story. Evening walks and coffee and long phone calls while Sable slept, and the particular intimacy of someone asking genuinely how your day was and waiting for the full answer. He had been careful, patient in a way that surprised me about him, though I was learning that many things about Stellan Voss were a surprise once you were on the inside of the perimeter. The alpha certainty and the professional coldness were genuine, but they were a surface that covered something considerably more intricate. He was not cold, he was careful. There was a difference that I was slowly learning to see. The night he was at my apartment past midnight was not planned. Sable had developed an ear infection that week, and though she had been to the doctor and was on medication, she was uncomfortable and miserable, and communicating this with the full vocal range available to her. I had been up since 2 the previous morning, and I had run out of effective soothing techniques, and Stellan had called at 10:30 to check in, and heard, through the phone, the specific escalating cry of a miserable 4.5-month-old. He arrived at 11. He knocked quietly, let himself in with the key I had given him 2 weeks before, and came to find me in the nursery, standing in the center of the room with Sable pressed against my chest, swaying, eyes half closed, nearly out on my feet. "Give her to me," he said, quietly, so as not to startle either of us. "You don't have to. Go lie down." He was already taking her, sliding his hands under her with the confidence he'd been building over weeks of practice. And she transferred with a protesting sound that faded as he adjusted her against his chest and began walking the slow circuit of the room that I had walked so many times the carpet was going to develop a groove. "I'll come get you if she needs feeding. Go." I went. I lay down on the hallway floor for 10 seconds and then made it to my bed and was asleep before my face fully reached the pillow. I woke at 2:15 to the apartment being quiet. I lay there for a moment, listening to the particular quality of the silence, which was the absence of crying and the presence of something else. A low voice. I got up and went down the hall and stood in the nursery doorway. Stellan was sitting in the nursing chair, with Sable asleep on his chest. On the floor beside the chair was a scattered array of small white garments, the cloth diapers and the tiny onesies and the sleep sacks that had been sitting in the laundry basket for 2 days because I kept meaning to fold them and kept not having the hands. He was folding them. He was doing it one-handed, the other arm holding Sable, systematically working through the pile, folding each tiny piece with the same precise, attentive care he brought to acquisition documents, setting them in a neat stack on the footstool. He had not heard me yet. The small lamp on the dresser was on, throwing warm light across the room, smoothing the edges of a minuscule sleep sack flat against his knee, and his face was different from any version of it I had seen in 11 months of carefully observed distance. It was open, unhurried. There was something almost tender in it, in the specificity of his attention to this small domestic task in the middle of the night. In the arm he kept carefully still so as not to disturb the sleeping baby on his chest. I must have made some sound because he looked up. We looked at each other across the nursery. I realized, standing there in the doorway in my sleep shirt, with 2 days of exhaustion in my bones, and Sable's favorite dinosaur plush in my hand, because I had picked it up without thinking from the hallway floor, that I was entirely, completely, without any remaining professional distance, in love with this man. "She went down about 40 minutes ago," he said. "I didn't want to move." "You're folding baby clothes." He looked at the stack. The pile was there. "Stellan, it needed doing." He held up the sleep sack. "This one has the snaps in the wrong order." I refastened it. I sat down on the floor, in the doorway, because my legs had decided that was a reasonable thing to do. And I sat there and looked at him, Stellan Voss, the most feared alpha in the corporation, sitting in a nursing chair at 2 in the morning with my sleeping niece on his chest and a perfectly folded stack of tiny laundry beside him. And I felt something enormous and warm move through me from chest to fingertips. "Come here," he said. I got up and went and sat on the footstool, which was the only available seat, and we were close enough that our knees were almost touching, and he looked at me in the low warm light, and his free hand reached out and pushed my hair out of my face, very gently, the way he did things when he was not performing anything for anyone. "I was thinking," he said, about the fact that I am in your nursery at 2 in the morning folding clothes, and that this is the place I most want to be." He held my gaze. "That feels relevant." "It feels relevant to me too," I said. Sable made a small sound in her sleep, a satisfied, formless baby murmur, and we both looked at her, and then we looked at each other. And Stellan's mouth curved into the full, real smile that I had been cataloging for weeks, the one he gave almost no one, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in a building full of things designed to be impressive. "Go back to sleep," he said. "I have her." "You have work at 7. I have her," he repeated. I went back to bed. I lay in the dark and smiled at the ceiling for a very long time before sleep came. The 4-month sleep regression ended. Sable became gradually a person with opinions and preferences and the most expressive face I had ever seen on anything smaller than a large cat. She had Marin's eyes, that particular dark amber that caught the light, and she had developed a specific look for Stellan that she gave no one else, a look of absolute serious focus, as though she was carefully cataloging everything about him and finding it satisfactory. He began to keep things at my apartment: a spare phone charger, a toothbrush, a specific brand of coffee he ordered that I did not stock. These appeared gradually, each one a small, matter-of-fact statement. I made space for them. At work we were careful, professionally appropriate. The structure of our relationship kept separate from the structure of our jobs, which suited us both. He sent me contract briefs with red ink corrections. I sent back revised documents. We were colleagues in the building, and something else entirely outside it, and the two categories did not blur as much as coexist cleanly. Petra figured it out 3 weeks in, which was frankly longer than I'd expected. "You're different," she said one morning, studying me with the focused attention of someone who had spent 3 years reading the emotional weather of a difficult floor. "In what way?" "You smile at your phone." "I smile at lots of things." "You smiled at your phone with the specific expression of a person who has received a message from someone who makes them feel approximately 8 inches off the ground." She leaned back in her chair. "And the coffee on your desk is from the building's executive kitchen, which has a different cup than the floor kitchen. And no one sends coffee from the executive kitchen unless they are either being thanked or being romanced. Those are very different things." "Kieran," I said nothing, which said everything. "Stellan Voss," she said, not a question. "We're being discreet. You are smiling at your phone at your desk. I will work on that." She stared at me for a long moment with an expression that cycled through disbelief, recalibration, and something that landed eventually as genuine warmth. "Is he good to you?" she said. "Yes," I said, and it was the simplest true thing I'd said in some time. "He folded her laundry at 2 in the morning. He knows her feeding schedule. He bought the neurological development book and read it and had questions." Petra put her hand over her mouth. "I know," I said. "He read the book. He had notes, with tabs." She stared at the ceiling for a while. "Okay," she said at last. "Okay, he's good to you. That's what matters." "It's what matters," I agreed. The night he said it, Sable was 5.5 months old and asleep in the next room. And it was raining outside with the particular conviction of late autumn rain, steady and without apology. We were on the sofa with the day's ends in our hands. Him with a report he was annotating, me with the monitor on the cushion between us, and the lamp on, and the rain on the windows. And I was thinking about how this, specifically this, had become the thing I organized my days around, arriving at. "I want to talk about something," he said. I looked up. His tone was the deliberate one, the one that meant he had been building up to something. "All right." He set the report aside. He turned to face me more fully, and his expression was the one I had come to know as his actual face, the one underneath the professional architecture, the careful and direct and slightly grave one that meant he was saying something real. "I want to be here," he said. "Not in the way we've been doing it, which is good, but fragmented. I want to be here the way this room already looks when I'm in it, the way she already knows my face." A pause. "I want us to stop managing the distance and close it." "You want to move in," I said. "I want more than that." He held my gaze. "But that's the first part." I looked at him for a long time. The rain ran down the window. The monitor sat between us, carrying the soft static sound of a sleeping baby. 11 months ago I had been carrying coffee down a hallway and had become inexplicably frozen in the path of a weather system in a suit. And now here was that same man, in my living room, in the rain, with annotated acquisition reports and deep familiarity with infant developmental timelines, looking at me like I was the thing he had been learning to want to keep. "The first part," I repeated. "The rest can wait, if you want it to." "I don't want it to wait," I said. He reached across the space between us and took my hand, which was such a simple thing, and sat with the weight of everything that had led to it. "Okay," he said. "Okay," I said. Sable made a small sound through the monitor, a brief, murmuring sound, and we both looked at it, and then at each other, and Stellan smiled the real smile, and the rain kept doing what it was doing, and I thought, this is it. This is what it looks like, not the beginning of a story, not the middle, this precise moment, with its laundry, and its late nights, and its contract corrections, and its 2 a.m. warmth. This is what it was all building toward. 6 months after that night, Sable took her first unassisted steps in the hallway of the apartment that had become, without ceremony or announcement, ours. She stood in the middle of the hallway with the expression she had inherited directly from her mother, which was a look of absolute determination, slightly undermined by physical uncertainty. And she took 3 steps and then sat down hard on the floor and looked up at us with tremendous dignity. Stellan dropped to his knees in the hallway without hesitation, which I will never stop finding extraordinary. Stellan Voss, whose suits cost more than my first car, just going straight to the floor for her. Again, he said. She considered this. She looked at him. She put her hands flat on the floor and heaved herself back upright with the method that was uniquely hers, a kind of full-body commitment to vertical. And she walked 4 steps this time, wobbled, and landed against his chest with the decisive thud of someone who had aimed at something and reached it. He caught her. He held her up and she laughed, that whole-body baby laugh that seemed to require her entire physical infrastructure. And he was laughing too. And I was in the doorway of the kitchen, watching this, and I felt Marin in the room with me, the way I sometimes did in good moments, not as grief, but as something softer and more present. I thought, she would have loved you. She would have seen you exactly the way I see you. Later, after Sable was asleep, we stood in the kitchen making dinner in the comfortable parallel way we had developed, him handling the things that required precision, and me handling the things that required taste, which was a division we had arrived at naturally, and which Petra, upon hearing it described, had said was the most them thing she'd ever heard. She's going to be walking everywhere now, I said. Yes. He was measuring something with the focus he brought to precise tasks. We should look at the cabinet latches in the lower kitchen cabinets this weekend. Already on the list. And the coffee table corner on the right side, the padding is wearing. Also on the list. He looked at me with a small expression of satisfaction, the one that meant we had arrived at the same place by different routes. You're a good father, I said. It was the first time I had used the word, out loud, directly at him. He went still for a moment. She's not mine biologically, he said, carefully, giving the words room. I know what biology means, I said. I said what I meant. He looked at me across the kitchen island, and his face was doing the thing it did in the very specific private moments when the architecture came down entirely, and there was just the man underneath, clear and present, and completely without guard. You're a good father, I said again. You're her person. She knows it. I know it. He came around the island. He stood in front of me and put his hands on my face and kissed me in the way that was not about anything besides meaning it, and I put my hands over his and held on. I want to make it official, he said, against my forehead, the adoption, if you're willing. I've been waiting for you to ask, I said. He pulled back enough to look at my face. How long? About 4 months. You could have asked me. I know, I was enjoying watching you build up to it. You do this thing where you get very controlled and precise when you're about to say something important. I do not. You measured that stock twice just now. He looked at the measuring cup. He looked back at me. That's for accuracy. Stellan, the smile, the real one, full and unhurried, the one that still made me feel like the room had tipped slightly on its axis in the best way. Yes, he said. Fine, I was building up to it. It's one of my favorite things about you. I have a list of things about you that I will not be sharing because it would be unbearable for both of us. I want to hear it. No, you don't. I absolutely do. It's very long. Stellan. He kissed me again instead of answering, which was a deflection strategy I had identified early and had no interest in discouraging. There's a picture on the shelf in the hallway of our apartment. Sable took it accidentally with the tablet when she was 2 years old and somehow managed to capture, in the blurred, slightly tilted way of accidental toddler photography, the two of us in the kitchen on an ordinary evening, me at the counter with a contract open on my laptop, him at the stove, and between us the small, specific warmth of a life that had built itself from unusual materials. Sable, at the time I am writing this, is 3 years old and has the vocabulary of a small professor and the negotiating skills of someone who has spent her entire conscious life watching an acquisitions executive, and she uses the word baba for Stellan in a way that he pretends is casual and that you can see move through him every single time like a current. The adoption was finalized on a Thursday morning in a courtroom that smelled like wood polish and old paper, and Stellan held her the entire time with the exact same careful, complete attention he had held her with in my office 11 months after I had been standing frozen in a hallway, wondering if I was about to be fired. And afterward, we took her to lunch and let her order from the adult menu because it was that kind of day. And she chose soup and a bread roll, and methodically tore the bread into geometric pieces with the precision that made Petra, when I told her, put her head down on her desk, and make a sound. He still folds laundry at 2 in the morning sometimes. Not from insomnia or necessity, but from the habit of it, the particular quiet of that hour. And I have come in enough times to find him doing it in the nursery-turned-bedroom, Sable asleep in the next room now that she has graduated from the crib, folding tiny pajamas and small soft socks with the same unhurried care that he brings to everything he has decided matters. I always end up staying. I always end up beside him in that quiet, picking up the next piece, folding with him. This is what it looks like, from the inside. 2 people in a small warm room in the middle of the night, doing the smallest possible thing together. The most feared alpha in the corporation learned to fold baby clothes 2 in the morning. He learned it for her. He stayed for both of us. And I, who had spent 11 months managing my careful distance from a weather system in a charcoal suit, had never once regretted closing it. Not once. Not for a single minute. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me.